Previously in our series on abolitionist John Brown's life, we have discussed the brutal massacre at Potawatomi Creek and the following Battle of Blackjack, both excellent videos that I recommend watching before continuing on with this one. Today though, we are going to be focusing on and discussing John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry, considered by many the dress rehearsal for the impending Civil War. The setup for Harpers Ferry begins 2 years before that fateful month of October 1859, during the waning months of 1856 in Bleeding, Kansas. For his fighting and the stories coming out of Bleeding, Kansas in the West, John Brown became a cult-like symbol of the abolitionist movement very quickly, receiving the old nickname, Old Osawatomie. With this newfound fame in 1857, John Brown would return to the East in hopes of raising money for a large-scale assault on the institution of slavery. To help garner support and funds, John Brown's abolitionist allies fabricated propaganda saying that John Brown was unjustly accused of the murders at Potawatomi Creek by slave owners in an attempt to taint his reputation. Brown ran with these ideas and it became a focal point of his pitch for raising money. And while on the surface he claimed that the money would help fight slavery in Bleeding, Kansas and farther to the west, John Brown really wanted to strike slavery closer to its heart, preferably somewhere in Virginia. He would verbally discuss the possibility of moving against Harpers Ferry, a federal arsenal and armory, where he could find weapons he could use to arm an army of slaves. Majority of the funds Brown was able to raise came from a group of men who earned the nickname the Secret Six. The men of the Secret Six included Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Theodore Parker, George Stearns, Samuel Gridley Howe, Franklin Sanborn, and John Brown himself. Now with funding and a target, John Brown just needed a plan of action and an army for his attack on Harpers Ferry. In hopes of garnering support from slaves, John Brown would meet in the years leading up to Harpers Ferry with the most famous abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. In their several meetings, they would both come to respect each other and the passion they both held for abolishing slavery, but on how it should be abolished was where their beliefs diverged from one another, with Douglass searching for political action to end slavery and John Brown becoming more and more radical. Because of this separation of ideas, when John Brown asked Frederick Douglass to join him on his assault on Harpers Ferry, he refused, saying, quote, he was going into a perfect steel trap, from which he would never get out alive, end quote. Without his friend, on July 3, 1859, John Brown with his sons Owen and Oliver and trusted Lieutenant Jeremiah Anderson would travel to Sandy Hook, Maryland, a small village located a handful of miles from Harpers Ferry. Under the guise of Isaac Smith and his sons, John Brown would rent the old Kennedy farmhouse to both hide and train his men. For the next 3 months, the Kennedy farm would be used as their preparation grounds for the assault. Throughout the summer, men would begin to trickle in, but to John Brown's disappointment, few men actually came. By mid-October, Brown's fighting force included 22 men, 3 of his sons, and 5 freed African Americans. And while John Brown didn't have as many men as he wished for, he was not deterred, and on October 16, 1859, he would launch his assault on Harpers Ferry. Around 11 o'clock on October 16, 1859, John Brown would lead 18 men into Harpers Ferry, leaving 3 of his men behind to protect supplies left at the Kennedy farmhouse. Under the cover of darkness, the abolitionists flooded into Harpers Ferry, with specific instructions to take control of strategic locations, as well as capturing prominent people in society to use as hostages. All told, John Brown's men would take around 60 hostages, one of those being Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington, as well as taking control of the armory, arsenal, and eventually Hall's Rifle Works, while also cutting the telegraph lines going in and out of Harpers Ferry. Everything was going as planned for John Brown up until this point, but everything would then begin going downhill soon after. It all turned when a train pulled into the station at Harpers Ferry and John Brown's men held it up. Investigating, Hayward Shepard, a free black man who worked as a baggage handler for the railroad, would be shot and killed by Brown's men. Eventually, John Brown would let a train depart from Harpers Ferry, from which the train conductor would contact the president of the railroad, who in turn would contact the president of the United States, James Buchanan. And while he mobilized a military force to move in on Harper's Ferry, John Brown had to deal with local militants and civilians. Instead of retreating from Harper's Ferry after the successful sneak attack, John Brown and his men would decide to stay, thinking that they would be met by newly freed slaves and African Americans, who would then arm themselves and fight with abolitionists. But in reality, John Brown's small force was quickly surrounded by militia members, angered at the attack on their beliefs and properties. John Brown would quickly fall back to the armory, where he would try and reason and negotiate with this new opposition. In attempts to negotiate, several members of John Brown's men would be killed while under a white flag. This included his son Watson. Seeing that he was getting nowhere and fearing the counterattack by the United States government, John Brown and his remaining men would retreat to the old armory engine house, where they would prepare for their final stand. By the morning of October 18, 1859, 90 United States Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, would reach Harper's Ferry. They would offer John Brown and his remaining men the chance to surrender, but Brown refused. And with this, Lee would launch his assault on the armory engine house, nicknamed John Brown's Fort. Using hammers and other tools, the Marines quickly stormed and overtook the remaining raiders in a matter of minutes. But in that time, a Marine private by the name of Luke Quinn would be shot and killed, along with 5 of the raiders, including another of John Brown's sons, Oliver. John Brown would be mortally wounded, and he, along with 4 of his men, would be captured and taken by Lee and the Marines. 7 of Brown's men would escape, including his last surviving son, Owen, but 2 of the men would eventually be captured and brought back to Virginia. John Brown, severely wounded, would be rushed through his trial and hearings, and along with his captured men would be convicted and found guilty of murder, inciting slave insurrection, and treason against the state of Virginia. John Brown wished he could have ended slavery without firing a weapon and killing anyone, but he believed that there was no way of ending slavery and truly changing America without it. He would write in a note in his final days, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." End quote. He would be hanged on December 2nd, 1859. And while superficially it appeared that John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a failure, the reality of the situation was that it represented the South's deepest fears. Not only were they afraid that this might cause a stir among their slaves and create more slave insurrections, but when they learned that John Brown was funded by prominent white Northern abolitionists, they saw the attack as a Northern invasion. And from there, both sides mobilized militarily, leading to the brutal Civil War to end slavery.